that was more than generous. As you'll get from a lot of what Bob was saying about my past work, a lot of the work I do is in history of gender, and very often my focus has been on the history of masculinity. So when ACMRS approached me earlier this year and said, we're doing this series on Renaissance women, I thought, well, this is great. I can talk about femininity as well as masculinity and sort of refresh my memory and work with some figures that I haven't been focusing on, because I've been focusing on sort of the way that early modern culture represents masculinity and maleness and so on. So it's interesting for me to be looking at femininity, and this is such a great series of public lectures. I've attended a couple of them myself as in the audience, and it's really exciting. So I was very glad to be part of it. Well, let me see here. Let's get started. Here's the sort of what I wanted to cover tonight. You hear there are all these images out in culture about women of the Italian Renaissance, and in fact, I was a little ignorant about this when I started looking into the background for this talk. I didn't realize how much of this stuff was out there. I mean, I was aware, okay, there's this TV show, The Borgias, there's all this stuff, but it's in video games, it's all over the place. So you've got the image of the sophisticated courtesan, the noblewoman, warrior women. Women of the Italian Renaissance have often been idealized and glamorized in paintings, books, and films. And this is something that goes all the way back to the 16th century. They were doing this themselves. The women and men of the Italian Renaissance had these images, as we'll see. But did Italian women have a Renaissance? In other words, how much were actual women living in 16th century Italy able to participate in this wonderful world of sort of glamour, culture, all the things that we associate with the Renaissance? How much could they really participate in that, and how much is our sort of looking back at them and sort of idealizing them or glamorizing them, or just wanting to celebrate the positive elements of their lives, but in some ways missing out what the realities of those lives were? So how do fiction and myth compare to the actual lives of early modern women? And one of the first things I'll say is, when we are talking about early modern anybody, we usually are missing out on about 99% of the population, because usually the records that have survived are elite records. They're talking about noble women. They're talking, I mean, if I asked you to name someone from the Renaissance, almost anyone you would name would be someone who was in the top 2%, the top 1%, the top 5% of that culture on any level of measure. I mean, we're still talking about a culture that's primarily agrarian, and where the vast majority of people do not have direct access to basic things like literacy. I mean, Italy is still a peasant culture in the Renaissance. England is still a peasant culture in the Renaissance. Most people are working the land, and they are not participating in anything that we're talking about in any kind of direct way. And trying to uncover that popular culture is very difficult, because a lot of it is non-written. It's performative, it's social, it's oral, and the traces of it haven't always survived. So what we're looking at tonight is some famous women from the Italian Renaissance. We're looking at elite women, or women that in some sense got to the top of their culture in one way or another. And I thought we'd start by looking at an image from the period. This is a painting by the Venetian painter Titian. What's it a painting of? What's it a painting of? What are we seeing? Yeah, so okay, faith and something else. What is it a painting of? If I just show you this and say, okay, here's a painting from the Italian Renaissance, what is it? How do we understand this? What sense can we make of this artifact? What could it be? It's a picnic. Well, they're outside. They're outdoors. So it's well. Here's one question to ask ourselves: Is this a realistic scene or not? No, it's not a realistic scene. And the first attempt to understand it here was, well, it must be faith, and in other words, it's got to be an allegory. It's got to be symbolic. It can't be just actual people. Why do we deduce that? Well, one's clothed and one isn't. So you assume that from what we know of 16th century European culture and perhaps weather, though it is Italy, that you wouldn't have this sort of naked person just sort of sitting around in a field. So there has to be some kind of symbolic level. Yes. That is the title that's been given to the painting. The title that's been given traditionally to the painting is Sacred and Profane Love. There are a couple of elements of this that are interesting. One is, this is not the original title for the painting. We don't know what the original title of the painting was. This is a title that the painting has acquired over time. The other is, let's pretend for a moment that it is sacred and profane love. It's a symbolic picture, as we've deduced. And so, which is sacred love and which is profane love?
Sacred.
Sacred is this one?
Yeah.
No.
Why?
Because she has no trappings. She has no trappings of wealth or whatever, and she's innocent.
That's one interpretation of the painting, and it's one that I tend to go with. Is that now we might look at this and say, okay, one is sacred love and one is earthly love. Well, earthly love is a naked person. And the first thing that we get when we try to get back into the Italian Renaissance is, wait a minute, that's not necessarily their symbol system. That's not necessarily the way they understand things. Nudity can be, as you said, a symbol of simplicity, a symbol of innocence, a symbol of all these sort of spiritual qualities, the naked spirit before God, etc., etc. And this then would be profane love because she's dressed as what? A courtesan. And this is something we're going to be talking about tonight. What's a courtesan? A courtesan is a prostitute in that a courtesan is paid for sexual favors. But a courtesan is not just any prostitute. A courtesan is a prostitute who has a certain amount of status, a certain amount of education, a certain kind of clientele, and a certain amount of protection that allows her to keep all that. Courtesan culture thrived in two main cities in the Italian Renaissance, and they were Venice and Rome. Any ideas why these would have been the world centers for high-class prostitution? Yeah.
Well, there is a lot of wealth in those cities, and
yes.
predominantly male.
Yes, they are wealthy cities, and you're talking about a patriarchal society in early modern Italy in any case, but in Rome and Venice have two things that keep them apart from other cities. Rome, of course, is the center of the Catholic Church, which means there are a lot of men living there who are in the clergy, and also a lot of men who are traveling there to do diplomatic business with the church who are far away from their wives and families if they are not vowed to celibacy and then don't have wives and families. In Venice, it's a city of trade and business, and for the same reason there are all these merchants from all over Europe and from the East, from Turkey as well, who are living in Venice, long way away from their families. These men are very wealthy, they're very powerful, and they are a natural clientele for the favors of courtesans. And so you have this kind of courtesan culture. So that's one way of reading this painting, is to say that, okay, these are what in classical mythology and philosophy are called the two Venuses. There are two kinds of love. There's an earthly kind of love, a sexual love, and there's a heavenly kind of love, a spiritual love. And this would be the earthly one, and this would be the heavenly one. Well, problems with this. The outfit that this woman is wearing is a 16th century Venetian wedding dress. And it's the same dress that is worn in contemporary paintings of the heavenly Venus. So it may be that she's in fact heavenly love. This, on the other hand, is a naked Venus, if it's Venus, and naked Venus is usually the earthly Venus. We think of Botticelli's Birth of Venus and various other. So the interesting thing about this painting to me is that you can flip it either way and we don't know. In other words, it's not that easy to tell when you're looking at images from Renaissance Italy, when you're looking at a sacred image and when you're looking at a sexy image, and you might be looking at both at the same time. And that's kind of an interesting idea. Let's carry this one step further. Here's another painting by the same painter, Titian. It's called the Venus of Urbino, named after the man who bought it, who was the Duke of Urbino. And what is this a painting of? Besides somebody lying naked on a couch. Nobody knows who it was, and nobody knows if the painting was painted for the Duke of Urbino or if the Duke of Urbino purchased the painting. We know that he's the first owner. We don't know how he came to get it. We don't know if he commissioned it. So it's tricky to know that we know that the model actually posed for other paintings by Titian, so she's unlikely to be someone who's specifically related to the romantic life of the Duke of Urbino. But who is she? What kind of a woman is she? Well, no, she's not technically an odalisque, because an odalisque is an inhabitant of a harem, and she's not. There's nothing to indicate from the iconography or anything in the painting that she's meant to be Muslim or not European.
Married, a wealthy woman of leisure with her lapdog at her feet there.
Yeah, here's the question: Is she a courtesan or a noblewoman? Why would you say courtesan?
Wealth and money.
Lots of noble women eat well too. And the body, like the face, is idealized, of course. These are paintings in some sense. If this is a painting of Venus, and we don't know if it is for sure, it's an idealized image. It's not meant to be an ordinary woman. But one of the things, we might think nakedness must be courtesan, must be sexual. But there are a lot of things that cut against that. Here we have a little doggy asleep on the bed. What does a little doggy symbolize in Renaissance Italy?
Fidelity.
Fidelity. Fido, the dog, which is Latin for faith. That's the dog. A sleeping dog is typical of marriage portraits, because the idea is that the woman is chaste, faithfulness is at peace, everything is calm. Sleeping puppy dog. What's going on in the background? Yes, the women are going into what is called a Casoni, which is Italian for big chest. Big chests are what marriage gifts come in. They're associated with weddings, and in fact, the format of this painting, the kind of cinemascope format where it's longer than it is tall, is typical of Casoni paintings that were actually on the sides of Casoni. So as was the previous painting we looked at, which also suggests that both of these paintings, the Sacred and Profane Love and the Venus of Urbino, were in some sense associated with marriage. And again, I bring these things up to sort of caution us against being too quick to read based on our own assumptions about sexuality, about marriage, about what's appropriate, about what's inappropriate, what certain gestures mean, the other thing that everyone points out about this painting is that it is the first nude in Western art where the woman is looking at the viewer. And people have puzzled, what does this mean? She's not just an object to be observed, though she's clearly an object to be observed, right? She's meant to be looked at. The painting invites us to look at her nakedness, and yet she's looking right back at us, which is not usually the way that Venuses are portrayed. Is this, what does this do to the gender dynamics of the painting? What is Titian saying about this woman, or about marriage, or about love, or about sexuality? It's very complicated, and generally speaking, the more you learn about it, the more complicated it gets. It doesn't get simpler as you go. Do you have a question?
Oh, just a comment. Her hair is unbound and down. And
yeah,
uncovered, which
that might suggest sensuality. But of course, one of the things that is odd to us, or can be odd to us, about Italian Renaissance marriage paintings is that they are often very, very sexual. The idea being that you're married, you're going to have children, you want fertility. Fertility is good, and there are more extreme examples than this that I don't have pictures of today, but paintings that we might think of as something that is sort of lascivious or not connected with marriage, that's connected with just sex, often in these Renaissance paintings are connected with marriage, with sexuality as the future of the family, as children being born, etc., etc. The other thing we don't know here is the dramatic setting. Are they getting clothes? Are they putting her clothes away? In other words, she's preparing herself for bed, or are they getting her clothes out because she's about to get dressed? Either way, her hair down could just be part of the naturalistic part of the painting. She's in bed. She's not dressed yet. The maids are going to get her dressed, or she's been undressed, and that's why her hair is that way. Let's move to another painting. This is a painting by Carpaccio, painted a little earlier than the Titian painting. This is known as Two Venetian Women. And once again, similar stuff here. The title of this painting is not known. It's called Two Venetian Women because we know it's a Venetian painting and they're women. Very often in art books, you'll see it called Two Courtesans. Again, the more you learn about the painting, the harder it is to determine whether these women are meant to be pictures of courtesans or pictures of wives. They're obviously living in some kind of luxury. The dogs, again, tend to be symbols of fidelity, as are the doves, but, and these little jars and things are often associated, again, with weddings and marriage gifts and chastity. The idea that, you know, you can use a cup or a jar to represent female chastity, and broken cups and jars represent unchastity. So there's that. In any case, a kind of very elegant life. Well, let's start talking about some actual Italian women and sort of where they fit in. And the topic of this series is fearless females. So I was looking for sort of women who were taking leading roles or women who have become famous. And the first one that occurred to me was Isabella d'Este. Has anyone ever heard of Isabella d'Este? Yeah. What do we know about Isabella d'Este if we've heard of her? Yeah.
She's the daughter of the Duke of Urbino.
Yes.
And was extremely well educated. I think she was illegitimate.
No, she wasn't. No.
And she had a sister. One of them married Este, and the other one, the Duke of Milan, the sister.
Yeah, they were, I mean, one of the things you have to remember about Italy in this period, especially northern Italy, where all the women we're talking about tonight are from, northern Italy is not a country. It's a series of city-states, all of which are, you know, they become independent, they conquer each other. Milan is a powerful one, Florence is a powerful one. Isabella d'Este is the Marchioness of Mantua. She marries the Duke of Mantua. D'Este is the name of her family, her birth family from Ferrara. And they're all interrelated. They all sort of marry each other, you know, they marry into each other's families and so on, in the way that aristocracies do. Isabella d'Este was an incredibly well-educated woman. Latin was her favorite language. She could also read Greek. She was, of course, fluent in Italian and also had a knowledge of other modern European languages. And she was a patron of the arts at a very high level. This is a drawing of her by Leonardo da Vinci. She kept trying to get Leonardo to paint her picture, but he never went beyond doing a drawing of her. She was also painted by the painter we've been talking about all night, Titian. There's a picture of Isabella d'Este by Titian. What do you notice about this picture of Isabella d'Este compared to the previous one? Yes, she has much nicer clothes on. This is actually a finished painting as opposed to just a sketch, so it's making more of an impression. So yes, she's wearing very, very elegant clothes. What else about this painting of Isabella? She looks younger. In fact, she looks nothing like she probably actually looked. This painting was painted for her by Titian when she was relatively advanced in years, and she said she wanted an image of herself looking very beautiful. And so he painted a beautiful young woman. We have no way of knowing how close this was to actually representing Isabella d'Este as she was. This was Isabella d'Este as she wanted herself to be. And this is something everyone says about early modern painting, especially paintings of powerful people. They're propaganda, they're PR, they're showing you what that person wants you to see of them. They're not in any sense like we would think of a photograph of someone. They are an elaborate representation of what that person wants you to understand about them. And this is true of portraits of Elizabeth I or of Henry VIII in England, and it's true of this portrait of Isabella d'Este. And it makes it very difficult to sort of talk about details of sort of what people looked like and so on. Isabella was multi-talented. She was a patron of any number of painters and artists, writers, philosophers. She had a whole team of scholars that worked for her. But she also took an active role in the political life of her city. And this is a pattern we'll see in various cases. There is no sort of model in early modern Italy for a woman to rule anything. That's not the ideal, that's not the aspiration of the society, that's not the rules. But what will happen is that a woman in an aristocratic family will all of a sudden find all of her male relatives killed or dead of natural causes, and she will often be in charge of a young male child. She will then become the regent of her city. In some cases, this means nothing. Powerful male relatives run everything for her. In other cases, like Isabella's, it means she runs the city for a while. And this is always a very ambivalent role. One of the things we find when we're looking for sort of powerful women in Renaissance Italy is that it's always ambivalent power, because the society is extremely patriarchal and is not set up for women to hold power in their own right, generally speaking. So when women hold power, it tends to be contingent. She has power until her son comes of age. A courtesan has power as long as she can stay on the good side of her powerful protectors. And this makes things very sort of dodgy for these people. Isabella ruled the city of Mantua during wartime. Her husband was taken prisoner, and she ruled the city for several years. When he got out of jail and came back to Mantua, their marriage fell apart, in part because she had done a better job running the city than he did, and she was smarter than he was, it seems. He later died, I think, of syphilis, and she then ruled for her son for a while. So she had control for quite a while. She showed personal bravery on several occasions. She was in the city of Rome when it was sacked by the imperial troops in 1527, and she had protection. She had the invading army had some of her relatives in it. And so she was able, they left her house alone, and she took a lot of refugees into her house and saved a lot of people's lives in a very, very desperate situation. So with Isabella d'Este, we have an example of a woman who we can see was cultured, was educated, had political power, and also was someone of immense bravery. Next example is someone who's probably better known than Isabella d'Este, and this is Lucrezia Borgia. What do we know about Lucrezia Borgia? She's the daughter of a pope. She's the illegitimate daughter of Pope Alexander VI, who was a Borgia pope. He was a Spanish nobleman who became pope. And popes aren't allowed to be married, but that didn't stop Alexander from doing whatever he pretty much felt like. And one of his illegitimate children, he had quite a family, one of his illegitimate children was Lucretia. Lucrezia Borgia is a name that has come down to us. It's a name that people recognize. She's been the subject of operas, she's been the subject of novels, she's been the subject of poems by romantic poets like Byron. We know almost nothing about Lucrezia Borgia that holds up if you actually go back and look at it. She was famously said to have committed incest with her brother Cesare Borgia. Unfortunately for, the more scandalous side of the myth, the people who said that were people who really badly wanted to destroy the Borgia family, and so, of course, they're incestuous, yeah. She was rumored to have murdered her second husband. Again, maybe not, no evidence. The people who accuse her of murdering her second husband are people who would have wanted to kill her second husband anyway, and would have wanted to kill her too. They tend to be sort of eminent, and the Borgias had a lot of enemies. They were very aggressive, and they were foreigners. They had come to Italy from Spain, from Catalonia, and they, Rodrigo Borgia was Pope Alexander VI. He was a very, very powerful man, and he wanted to establish his family as sort of the ruling aristocracy in any Italian cities they could get their paws on. And they were very disruptive, and the Italian nobility, of course, were not happy about any of this. And so the Borgias came down to us as this sort of hideous family who were, incestuous and poison. Lucretia is supposed to have a ring with poison in it that she would, put in your soup and stuff. Well, in the Vatican Palace, there are a series of rooms that were painted for the Borgia Pope. And in one of them, there's an image of St. Catherine of Alexandria that looks like this. And people have wondered if this is Lucrezia Borgia, because Lucrezia Borgia was said to be blonde and beautiful when she was young. So maybe this is Lucrezia Borgia. Here's a more famous painting said to be of Lucrezia Borgia. This is similarly from the same time. She's a woman who is blonde and beautiful. There is absolutely no evidence that suggests that this is Lucrezia Borgia in any way. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Tradition has sort of said it's Lucrezia Borgia, but this is the kind of tradition that happens when 200 years later someone finds a painting of a pretty blonde woman and says, that must be Lucrezia Borgia, because I read she was blonde. And maybe. Here is another painting said to be a painting of Lucrezia Borgia. And this is a painting from later in her life, and let's just look at the two of those together. Are they even paintings of the same person? They certainly don't look like it, though the nose is similar, the mouth is similar, the hair is obviously totally different, and you know, the one who painted this never got the memo about blonde.
She lost her chin.
Yeah, well, there's those kinds of things too. I mean, and obviously it's someone at a different age, but there's nothing really to connect those two except they're both said to be pictures of Lucrezia Borgia. And the other thing to think about when you think about Lucrezia Borgia is this woman who's often associated with sort of romance and wickedness and so on, and power. She's, you know, she's the poisoner, she's the plotting schemer and so on. Everything we can figure out is this woman had less power than almost anybody in the whole world. She married 3 times, always to people that were chosen for her by her powerful male relatives in order to advance the family in some fashion. She died at age 39 bearing her 8th child. This does not sound like the career of who we imagine when we say Lucrezia Borgia. This sounds like someone, and unlike Isabella and some of the other women we'll talk about, Lucrezia Borgia never had political power over anything. She was never sort of regent of a city or in charge of anything in any way except through whatever influence she could have had over her male relatives, which frankly doesn't seem to have been a whole lot, and they were pretty strong-willed guys. So there's a case where we've taken this woman who seems to have had very little power, especially given the wealth and comfort in which she lived, and made up, you know, as a culture, we've created this romantic image of this woman, Lucrezia Borgia, that has very little, you know, relation to what we know of her actual life. There's a kind of mythology that's taken her over. This is Catherine de Medici. Anybody know anything about Catherine de Medici?
Queen of France.
Queen of France, probably, and I think this is probably right, probably the most powerful woman in 16th century Europe. And remember, that includes Elizabeth I, Mary Queen of Scots, Marguerite de Navarre, Isabella d'Este, anybody you want to name. Catherine de Medici had, again, an interesting and fraught life. She was the daughter of the Medici family, which you would think was pretty good. They're the rulers of Florence. They're very wealthy. She was married as a teenager to a younger son in the French royal family, a French prince named Henry. The French were not particularly happy about this. The French aristocracy weren't, because the Medici were a bunch of bankers and not real nobility. And besides, she was Italian. So what we think of is really, you know, wow, she's from Florence, she's a Medici. They looked down on that in Paris. And she married Henry. Now, she married the younger son. They weren't going to marry some banker's daughter from Italy to the heir, right? They married her to the spare. But as often happens, the heir died. The French royal family in the 16th century dropped like flies. And the heir to the throne died, and that meant that his younger brother Henry became heir to the throne, which meant that when Henry became King Henry, Catherine became the queen, which didn't help her all that much in terms of power, because Henry was madly in love with a woman named Diane de Poitiers, and he was incredibly public about it. He put his and Diane's initials up everywhere. They did everything together. Catherine stayed in the palace and had baby after baby after baby to keep the French royal family going, while Diane de Poitiers had all the power at court, and Henry was the king. Until Henry went jousting and got a lance right through his eye. Died several days later in horrible agony. Diane de Poitiers was kicked out of the palace about 5 seconds later, and Catherine took over as regent for her sickly child, who was king for a while and then died. But that was okay, because she had another sickly child who was king for a while and then died, which was okay, because she had another sickly child. So she was regent to 2 French kings, and then the third one, by the time her third son became the king of France, he was an adult, but she was his closest confidant for years. So she was also the continuity of power. She was the one who had been around running things while the kings were dying every 5 years or so. Now, this is a time of enormous turmoil in France. There are really horrible religious conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, and they lead to this. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Here's Catherine in the back here. This is a Protestant engraving of the Massacre of Protestants on St. Bartholomew's Day. There's Catherine in the background gloating over the corpses. Catherine started out having a conciliatory attitude towards the Protestant minority, but after a while, you know, things didn't calm down. In fact, things got worse. And what happened in 1572 in Paris was there was a big Protestant wedding of some Protestant nobility, and there was an uneasy truce while this went on. The Protestant nobleman who was married, a man named Coligny, was attacked and badly injured. And Catherine and the other Catholic nobility in the royal family were afraid that since he'd been injured, that the Protestants would attack them in revenge. So they decided to do it first. And they started just by killing the sort of upper level Protestants in Paris, who had all come in for the wedding. So there were all these Protestant nobles in Paris. They started it as a sort of small scale, you know, the word we would use today would be surgical. But the Parisian mob got wind of this, and they basically just killed every Protestant they could find for a couple of days. And it was this real, I mean, it was a real horrible thing. And Catherine, you know, Catherine's responsibility for it has been debated ever since. But here's one of the interesting things about someone like Catherine de' Medici. You know, if you try to hold her up as some kind of model of, I don't know, female empowerment or something, you also have to deal with the fact that being empowered in the 16th century meant killing a lot of people who got in your way. And she was quite, you know, she was quite capable of doing that, even though her public persona was always the sort of pious widow, which fit really well with her role as regent. She was a very shrewd woman, and she managed to rule France in a very difficult period in its history for many years. She was a great patron of the arts. She sometimes gets credit for introducing Italian food to France, which people think this had some part in the development of French cuisine. She's often given credit for the sort of early roots of French ballet, because you bring Italian court dancing into France. There was a larger cultural transmission between Italy and France in the 16th century, and it didn't depend just on Catherine, but she did have this role. Her great desire herself was to be a patron of architecture, and unfortunately all of the buildings she built have not survived French history. She built the Tuileries Palace, which was destroyed in 1870. She built several other sort of prominent buildings in Paris, which did not survive the various wars over the years. So there's not much left of her sort of physical legacy. So let's move from people who are sort of politically, women who are politically powerful, to women artists. This is Vittoria Colonna, who was a poet and a friend of Michelangelo. This was something else women could do. Vittoria Colonna was the Marchioness of Pescara, so a smaller Italian city-state. And she, again, the model we're getting familiar with, she marries someone, and you know, she does the Italian aristocratic wife thing, has children. Then he dies, and in her case, instead of, you know, taking over the city or ruling France or whatever, what she does instead is she devotes herself to poetry. And she writes love poetry. She also writes religious poetry. And in her later life, she became very close with Michelangelo. He was very good friends with her, and they exchanged sonnets and so on. Mostly Michelangelo wrote religious sonnets later in his life, and they both had this sort of spirit. So here you've got a painting of her, and you know, you can see the sort of piety. She's got her hand on her chest. She's pointing to her book. She's an author. Here's another author. This is Tulia d'Aragona. What does this painting suggest about her?
Was she military?
No, she wasn't. What suggests military?
From here, it looks like she has a lion's paw or something like that in front of her chest. I can't quite make it out. She's
She's got this scepter, which suggests some kind of power and so on, and she does have this fur sort of over her shoulder. The Latin inscription is not entirely legible, but she was another famous poet in 16th century Italy. But unlike Vittoria Colonna, who was sort of this pious aristocratic widow, Tulia d'Aragona was a courtesan. And courtesans were often very highly educated, as well as you know, whatever other skills they had in terms of their sexual ability or of their, you know, their wealth and their sophistication in fashion and so on. And all of these women were sort of fashion leaders. But Tullia made a name for herself as a poet, and also beyond just being a poet, she also led a literary sort of salon where philosophers and so on would gather, and she actually wrote a Platonic philosophic dialogue called Discourses on the Infinity of Love, which was a relatively popular intellectual genre in 16th century Italy, the sort of scholarly, philosophical, Platonist dialogue about love. And so here you get a courtesan who's contributing to that debate, which is usually something that women are not allowed to participate in Renaissance Italy. Yeah.
A French tourist to Venice and Rome lamented that it cost more to have conversation with a courtesan than it did to do other things.
Well, that's a great example, because some of the most fun stuff we have about courtesans is from tourists, and that actually makes a perfect perfect transition. Here is here's an engraving of a Venetian courtesan. You notice the very elaborate hairstyle. Venetian women were renowned for not only having elaborate hair, but also for having blonde hair, often dyed blonde or bleached blonde. They apparently would sit on the roof all day in Venice, just sort of bleaching their hair in the sun and putting various things on it. A couple of things to notice about her dress. One is the sort of open shirt, sort of low-cut blouse or open blouse. That was common, but again, that was common for courtesans, and it was also sort of scandalously common for more fashionable women. So that's hard. She also has these amazing shoes called chopines. These are these they're sort of high heels on steroids. And they were extremely popular in Venice, apparently because of the water. You could keep your gown out of the water if you wore chopines. Chopines actually survive, and here's an example of a chopine. So you can imagine sort of walking around on those. You'd want to stay in the gondola a lot, I think. And it gets more extreme than that. Yeah, those are the really tall chopines. And these show up in all sorts of accounts, and of course they still survive. Well, I thought I'd read a couple of excerpts. There was an English traveler in the early 17th century named Thomas Coriat, and he was kind of a strange guy in a lot of ways. But he traveled all over Europe and wrote all these accounts of all the different things he did. One of the funniest things he writes is he goes to Italy and he discovers they all have this really funny thing they do. They eat their food with this tiny little metal pitchfork. And then he says, but you know what? It's not a bad idea. And this is the phrase that always sticks with me from Korea. Because all men's hands be not alike clean. And he goes back to England. He's the first Englishman to eat with a fork, and everyone laughs at him and thinks he's just being ridiculous with this tiny little pitchfork. He can't just stick a spoon or a knife in it or pick it up in his hands. He's going to have this cute little thing. But here are some of the things that Coriat has to say about Venice. He says, and this is just talking about general women that he sees in the street. Most of the women, when they walk abroad, especially to church, are veiled with long veils, whereof some do reach almost to the ground behind. It is the custom of these maids, when they walk into streets, to cover their faces with their veils for modesty, the stuff being so thin and slight that they may easily look through it. You can very seldom see her face at full when she walks abroad, though perhaps you earnestly desire it, but only a little glimpse thereof. So he finds the veil itself becomes this sort of sexual thing for Coriat. Almost all the wives, widows, and maids do walk abroad with their breasts all naked. And this is probably not strictly speaking true, as a lot of the things that Coriat reports are not strictly speaking true. But it might mean that they're just showing a little more than English women would show, which might be natural because they're in Venice, not London. It's hotter. And many of them have their backs also naked, even almost to the middle, which some do cover with slight linen. A fashion methinks very uncivil and unseemly, especially if the beholder might plainly see them. And then he goes on and says how horrible it is. However, it is much used in both Venice and Padua. And then he starts talking, this is just respectable women walk around like this, but he then talks about courtesans. The name of a courtesan of Venice is famous all over Christendom. As for the number of these Venetian courtesans, it is very great. For it is thought there are of them in the whole city and other adjacent places at least 20,000. And this is high, but there are more modest estimates that it's 10,000 in a population of 100,000, which seems, 1 in 10. That seems a little high. but it was a major factor in the sort of demography of the city. A most ungodly thing that there should be toleration of such licentious wantons in so glorious, so potent, so renowned a city. For methinks that the Venetians should be daily afraid lest their winking at such uncleanness should be an occasion to draw down upon them God's curse and vengeance from heaven, and to consume their city with fire and brimstone, as in times past he did, wait for it, Sodom and Gomorrah. But they, not fearing any such thing, do grant large dispensation and indulgence unto them. And for that, these two causes. First, to avoid worse harm. For they think that the chastity of their wives would the sooner be assaulted were it not for these places of evacuation. But, and you can't quite figure this one out, but the gentlemen do even coop up their wives always within the walls of their houses for fear of these inconveniences, much as if there were no courtesans in the city. And this is something that foreign travelers always remark on, is that in the northern Italian cities you don't see women in the street. Unless they're going to church and then they're going in groups. There really is this kind of gender segregation in a way that there wasn't in northern cities like Paris or London. And this is something that travelers always notice, that women are not just walking around the street. And there have been studies done of sort of urban space in Renaissance Italy that point out the way that urban space is turned into sort of masculine space. Women are not welcome, except in certain restricted things, churches, and going to and from. The second cause, Couriet says, why the Venetians encourage prostitution is for the revenues which they pay unto the Senate for their toleration, and it's enough to maintain a dozen of their galleys. So they tax them, and they use the taxes to support the Navy, which of course Venice is that's a naval power. Couriet talks all about, sort of the various skills and beauties that the courtesans have. He talks about how they all use makeup, even though they're pretty already, they all use makeup, which he thinks is very bad. Varnish is the word he uses. This is standard 16th century stuff, makeup, bad, 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 bad. There's all this moralistic discussion about makeup. He also goes on, though, to say that they're great musicians, they're very skilled at playing music, and they're very skilled at talking. Getting back to the point that you made earlier about the French traveler. Also, thou wilt find the Venetian courtesan a good rhetorician and a most elegant discourser, so that if she cannot move thee with all these foresaid delights, she will essay thy constancy with her rhetorical tongue. The other thing that Couriet goes on and on about, which is kind of funny, is he has this idea that if you get into a gondola and you don't tell the gondolier right away where you're going to go, they will kidnap you and take you to a brothel. And then you won't be allowed to leave. And he also points out, and this is an interesting thing, he says that if you try to leave without paying, they will hunt you down and kill you, and that the police will help them. that basically this is seen as a source of income for the Venetian state, and if a prostitute trying to enforce payment, Couriet believes, and this is not necessarily true, but it's the impression that he gets in the story that he tells, is that the state will back them up on that. You better pay. Part of the fame of Venetian courtesans was spread through Venetian courtesan flip cards and things like this. This is you have a picture of the courtesan here, and you've got Cupid and so on, and then you flip it up and look what she's got under her dress. She's wearing men's pants. So there's some kind of suggestion of cross-dressing there, or not getting what you think you're getting. Yeah, there's the chopines again. Yeah, she's wearing the chopines and she's wearing pants. So, and this actually, it is this, you can sort of flip it up if you actually have the card. Well, here is an actual Venetian courtesan as opposed to a mythical Venetian courtesan. This is Veronica Franco, and she is the topic of the book that I was recommending tonight, The Honest Courtesan by Margaret Rosenthal from USC. This is a great, it is a scholarly book, so it's not sort of a light read, but it has all sorts of really fascinating stuff about Franco's life, her conflicts with the way that she sort of made her way within this kind of patriarchal society as a courtesan and as an intelligent, learned woman, and the way that she sort of negotiated all these various pressures to create a kind of space for herself. She was one of the most famous courtesans in Venice for her beauty, but also for her eloquence and skill. And we know that she was one of the most famous courtesans in Venice because when the French King Henry III, the youngest of Catherine's sons, the last of Catherine de Medici's sons to be King of France, he was King of Poland before he was King of France. They didn't have any work for him in France, so they sent him off to be King of Poland. And then his brother died, and it was like, come back to France, you can be King of France now. So on his way from Poland to France, he stopped off in Venice. And the Venetians were worried about war with France. They had had a very testy relationship. And they knew that he was young, and he hadn't really traveled all that much. He'd been to Warsaw. And they brought him into Venice, and they did the world's biggest snow job on him. They wanted to just impress him with the wealth of the city, the power of the city, the smooth functioning of the city, and also the luxurious level of entertainment in the city. One of the things they did for him was the Venetians pioneered mass production and assembly line production, and what they produced in an assembly line fashion were war galleys, which they needed a lot of, partly because they were always losing them in fights with the Turks, and partly because war galleys had a limited shelf life. They only last a few years before they start to warp and things like that. So they set it up so that when Henry came to Venice, they built an entire war galley from nothing to finished galley in the water with a crew in it in 24 hours. They couldn't do this all the time, but if they set everything up, they could do it once, and that was impressive. The other thing they did to impress him was they hired Franco to spend the night with him. So that gives you some sense of her standing in the city in a good and a bad sense, right? She's being used by the city in a certain way, and it's pretty clear what she's supposed to do when she spends the night with him, but also that this is something that the state is calling on her services. Yeah.
And she could not say no.
Oh no. Oh gosh, no. I mean, not without throwing her entire life out the window. I mean, she could say no and then flee, but yeah. Yes.
And they were actually bragging rights for her as well, that she had vetted the King of France.
Oh yeah, because then she can raise her rates. She can. I mean, it's a win-win in that sense. There's also, and this is the way that she's forced to look at it. It's a cutthroat business. I mean, it really is. It's not. There's all this sort of stuff about how glamorous it was to be a courtesan. It was a really rough and very precarious life. Yeah.
But there was very little else a
Yes.
woman could do
Exactly.
to support herself in that time and society.
Exactly, because Italian Renaissance society, no matter how beautiful it was and so on, it was very, very patriarchal and very, very limited in women's possibilities. When I was preparing this talk, we were talking about, well, what were the jobs that women did in Renaissance Italy? And I dug around. The two jobs that women did outside the home for money in Renaissance Italy, by far the two greatest were, yes.
Wet nurse.
Yeah, that's part of it. None is a whole other category because they're not doing that for money. That's a vocation. That's not a job. Prostitution and domestic service, which, if you think about it, is just moving the duties of a wife into the cash economy, right? You're being paid for sex. You're being paid to clean and nurse the baby and do all these other things that a wife would do as part of her relationship with her husband for upkeep but no pay. You move it out into the commercial realm. But the point is, and this is the thing that's sort of hard for us in some ways, is that nobody thought it was a good thing to have women in the commercial realm. Women might be able to succeed in it, but it wasn't something that people generally thought was a good thing in this society. Let's move on. Here's another portrait of Veronica Franco by Tintoretto. One other thing I wanted to talk about was, we've been talking about how women are disempowered, and there you see the sort of exposure. And more than in the other one, it's interesting to think the same painter painted the two pictures of them. It will be interesting to know, who commissioned them. Did she commission them? Did someone else? What was the purpose? We've been talking a lot about women's lack of empowerment in Renaissance Italy, except in these sort of very special cases. And one of the things that's interesting about this to me is that one of the places you do see empowered women is in fiction. There's a tradition of warrior women in Italian epic poetry in the period, most famously in Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. And this goes back to the figure of Camilla, the Amazon in Virgil's Aeneid. But the idea that there are these warrior women. So if you're reading the romances, if you're reading the fiction, there are all these very attractive and very very positive images of women warriors. And yet, you know, in real life, there's not really, I mean, it's a little baffling as to why this would be, but it's a reliable feature of a kind of, it's chivalric narrative in 16th century Italy is the warrior woman. And not necessarily the sort of negative Amazon image they get from the classical world, where the Amazons are these sort of monster warrior women who, you know, heroes like Achilles have to kill the Amazons. And Camilla in Virgil gets killed. But here you have a painting by Botticelli. No one's quite sure if this is Camilla or Athena. And there are reasons to think it's not either of them. Athena isn't usually portrayed with an axe. Camilla is usually riding a horse. There's all sorts of stuff. But the allegorical content of the painting is fairly clear. It's female virtue punishing male lasciviousness, the centaur, the half-horse. She's taming him. She's you know, sort of subduing him, the defeat of the sort of half-animal by the superior human. It's kind of interesting in that case that you've got this female image of that. And these stories would go off in all sorts of interesting areas. In Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, there's a great episode where Bradamante, who's the warrior woman, that's her there, there's a young woman named Fiordespina who falls madly in love with her because she thinks she's a man. And so Bradamante sort of goes, oh, it must be my masculine attire, my armor that's causing you to fall in love with me. Oh, I'll change into women's clothes. And that doesn't work. Fiordespina's still attracted to her when she's in the women's clothes. And it seems like everything's going to be sad because Bradamante is like, well, I can't help you. I'm a girl. I can't become a man. But luckily for Fiordespina, Bradamante has a male twin. And they hook up and it turns out okay. But it gives you an idea of the sort of the way that in fantasy and in narrative there are all these possibilities that are being explored in kind of playful ways. Well, I want to finish up with this woman, Catarina Sforza, the Duchess of Forli. And Catarina is someone who I became aware of through Machiavelli, and there's a famous story in Machiavelli's Discourses, and I'll just read it to you. Certain conspirators, after murdering the Lord Count Girolamo of Forli, so there's this town of Forli, and there's a coup going on. Certain conspirators, after murdering the Lord Count Girolamo of Forli, made prisoners of his wife and of his children, who were still very young. By thinking they could not be safe, that is, the conspirators couldn't be safe, unless they got possession of the citadel, which the governor refused to surrender, they obtained a promise from Madonna Caterina, the wife, for so the countess was named, that on their permitting her to enter the citadel, she would cause it to be given up to them, her children in the meantime remaining with them as hostages, on the which undertaking they suffered her to enter the citadel. So they've killed her husband, they've got her children taken captive, and they say, you need to go into the fortress and tell them to surrender right now or we kill the kids. Well, here's what Caterina did. No sooner had she got inside than she fell to upbraid them from the walls of the murder of her husband and to threaten them with every kind of vengeance, and to show how little store she set upon her children, she showed them her genitals and told them scoffingly she knew how others could be gone. In the end, the rebels, having no leader to advise them and perceiving too late the error into which they had been betrayed, had to pay the penalty of their rashness by perpetual banishment. Now, no one knows whether Caterina really did flip up her skirt at the conspirators, and the reason I put that in italics is in the 19th century translation of Machiavelli's Discourses, the translator left that bit out because he thought it was a bit much, which is kind of interesting. We don't know if this really happened, but it's a striking image in a society that tended to disempower women fairly systematically. It's a striking image of specifically feminine power, and that's one of the things this series is looking at. Not only is Caterina relatively fearless, but she also, and it's interesting, you know, she says, I don't care about my kids, which would seem to be the antithesis of early modern femininity, and yet she's using the femaleness of her body in this story as her defiance. And that's a very interesting moment, and in some ways, you know, sort of symbolically for the culture, it doesn't matter whether it really happened or not. Machiavelli talks about it as if it did, and he's impressed at the way that she uses her body to defeat these conspirators. Well, other people have been impressed as well, and Catarina Sforza is now a character in the video game Assassin's Creed 2. And just this morning, I found this. from the badass of the week site. Catarina Sforza was an ultra-tough, mean-ass, tyrannical ruler who refused to back down from any challenge, no matter how impossible, never registered fear, and went out of her way to ensure that everyone who crossed her wound up suffering slow, excruciating, and horrific deaths by her vengeful hands. So she lives on. And I'll stop that.
You've asked a lot of questions, but we still have time for more if you like.
Yeah.
Don't you think, though, that when you're talking about them having that power, like Catarina at the end there, that they're still always relegating that and relating it some way to the femaleness and the kind of exotic quality of a female having the power? So it's really not like, oh, they have power just like a guy.
No, they don't have
It's exceptional because she kind of pushed her kids to the side, but then we had to throw in the genital part. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying, and
I just think that's an interesting idea to.
It's fascinating, and the thing about Machiavelli is Machiavelli conceives of power in gendered terms, and this is found in the Prince as well as in the Discourses, and it seems to be a fairly common feature of his thought. And here's how he conceives of power in gendered terms. Human agency is masculine. If I do something that's asserting my masculine will, and the word that Machiavelli uses is virtu, which sounds like virtue, but it doesn't necessarily mean goodness. It means strength, it means manliness, it means asserting your will on the situation. And Machiavelli is always advising people, especially in The Prince, where he's trying to get people to fight back against invaders of Italy. He's always telling people, you must use your virtue. He's always telling these male princes, you have to use your virtue, you have to use your virtue. But near the end of The Prince, he says, you know, virtue can only go 50% of the way because there's this force in nature that we can only make our will work 50% of the time because the rest of the time the world is going to be against us. And that power he tends to conceive of as feminine. And he describes it as this sort of river that flows. The image he uses is a river. You know the river's going to flood, so you can build dams. That's using your virtue, but sometimes the levee's going to break. And the force of the river is something that Machiavelli tends to conceive of as feminine, as opposed to the force of the dam builders, which is masculine. Though in another famous image from the same chapter, he says, well, if you need to be forceful because Fortune is a woman, Fortune is a lady, and she likes rough men, and she will not give in to any man who does not overpower her. And so you can see, but what you can see there is Machiavelli is, you know, the most sophisticated thinker about power in the 16th century, let alone 16th century Italy. And he is even, you know, so almost subconsciously conceiving of power as a gender fight between a masculine agent and a female world that will not fully be dominated. And that's why it's interesting when he comes back to Catarina using her femaleness to sort of stand up. Here are these men who are trying to achieve their conspiracy, and the whole chapter is, how do you do a successful conspiracy? What makes the conspiracy work and what doesn't? And these guys can't do it, and they run up against that. That doesn't mean Machiavelli is any kind of feminist or that he approves of this. He just sort of sees that there is this thing that men can't, they can only dominate it 50% of the time. And it's fascinating.
Well, no, we are out of time. But I want to tell you my favorite grammatical error on public display at ASU before we go. Apropos Catarina is showing her genitals. If you get in the elevator in the core building, there's a little sign above the buttons with a fireman's helmet on it and a little light. And the sign says, when flashing, exit elevator.
Nice. That's good advice.
Thank you again for a splendid talk. Thank you all for coming. Please consider coming back again and donating all your money to ACMRS. There's some refreshments over here.
And yes, I'm still here if you want to talk to me.
Yeah. Show more pictures. But thank you.
Thank you.